ये ऑडियो का नहीं,
ऑडियो
तो चार्ज है। नहीं, ये नहीं है मेरा लैपटॉप, दूसरा है। ठीक है, बाद में कर लेंगे।
अभी चेक कर लेते सर।
Manages the security division at Kolkata. His core area of interest is audit and compliance. And Mr. Avinash Kadam, CISA, CISM, CGEIT, CRISC. He's the past president of ISAC Mumbai chapter and past president of ISACA International. Avinash has 4 decades of experience in information technology management, information system audits, information security, consulting and training. He has worked as head of information security consulting and training of a lead organization for the past 11 years. Prior to this, Avinash worked in every role in IT, beginning his career as a hardware engineer for mainframes, minis, personal computers, and networks. Head of the computer operations, head of systems development, and finally head of IT department of major organizations, where he was responsible for every aspect of IT from strategy to implementation and day-to-day operations. Today, Avinash is a well-known and highly sought-after instructor trainer for various information security courses. He also is a regular columnist for Technology and Risk for Information Week. So today we have a very apt topic in today's scenario. You know, mobile apps were there for the last 10 or 15 years. We've talked about it for quite a while. But it never worked out very well because of the small real estate in our devices. It really became a hit when all these jing-bang devices came and all these new operating systems came which were good for mobile devices. But as Hemingway says, every wicked thing starts with innocence. So with this comes hacking. Initially, it was just hobbyist hackers who were trying to get into our information, but then it became more of a crime. So we'd like to hear from the panelists, very distinguished and knowledgeable panelists today about their opinion and about their ideas in this area. So we can start with Mr. Raman Kalra, if you would like to take it over from here.
Thank you, Bengal Chambers, for this nice opportunity to come and talk to all of you here. I will just a moment here. Black T-shirt, for a session like this, I'm trying to kind of, image like a security person. I said, no, that's not really the case, but that's a physical security part of it. But I'll try and share with you a consulting perspective around what this whole thing about privacy and identity mean really. It's a kind of a paradox, and why we say a paradox, because the subject is so vast. You can see it from a lens of an individual, which is all of us in our own individual capacity. So me as Raman Kalra, what does it really mean for me? You can see this subject as an enterprise, as a business enterprise. What are the really aspects of this whole subject from an industry perspective, from the government perspective, from a terror, from threat, from multiple aspects. What I am going to talk about a little bit today is more centered around the social media aspect of this, and we heard in the previous session the whole things about what you can really do in Facebook or other kind of social sites, and a lot of times you end up doing something which you never thought you intended to do about it. So the identity, which is who you are, what you are, and what potentially that you don't know what you are intending to be, how much of that you have in control, how much of that you don't have in control, becomes very important. Now the social sites, media, it's a network. It's everywhere. It's the new way of living our life. It's a new way of doing our business today. We really can't pretty much leave aside anything else in today's world if we are not a part of this whole web somewhere. And when I say web, it's not like a World Wide Web, but this whole, the social gambit as we all call it. Now, if you look at it in terms of the magnitude, the size, the kind of people who are online, 2 billion, or rather more than 2 billion, this is still a little dated, but the study says we'll have about 50 billion devices going forward in next few years, 50 billion. The number of users on Facebook, put them together, it's more than many other countries in the world. The data, very interesting, every 2 days the amount of data that gets created today is more than what perhaps happened in the decades of, in the centuries of existence of human being earlier on. So the volume, the magnitude is so high, and if you see the kind of data which is getting created every day, any such volume, any such data explosion brings with it a lot of issues around privacy, a lot of issues around the intended use of that data vis-a-vis how it is really actually getting used in the real world. Now, with that whole thing, from a media perspective, from an individual perspective, there are of course a lot of benefits of being on a social network. From a professional perspective, you see, it's about networking, and it has tremendous. I'm sure, I don't know how many people in the room right now are on LinkedIn, which is perhaps the most robust professional networking. We won't do a count here, but most of the people are using these networks extensively. On a personal footprint also, connecting your life experiences, sharing it with your connections, sharing it with your people who are living across the globe, different sites, be it Facebook. So while LinkedIn could be the leader on the professional side, Facebook has emerged as a community which is bigger than a real community now. Now, all that benefits are fine, but there are certain risks which comes inherent with this. The risks like what you do over there, what you speak over there, is always being tracked. Tracked is not a right word, but is always being referred to in some aspect or other. What if the kind of apps which are there on Facebook, for example, which instantly keep on saying that someone checked in here or someone checked in there, has also its own implications. You don't know indirectly what is being used by where. So a lot of times there is a lot of excitement which gets generated once you are on such sites. There are a lot of, for example, someone asked me sometime that, I'm booking a train ticket, why do I need to give 5 pieces of information? I asked that, do you really have an option? The fact is that if you want to use these, there is certain mandatory fields which are required for you to fill in. Those mandatory fields you can't do away with. Now the question that whether it is really required for that intended subject by the service provider, perhaps no. But also the other fact is that moment you subscribe to it, moment you use that feature, that facility, unknowingly you are signing up with a lot of disclaimers which that service provider has come with. None of us in this room, I'm pretty sure, excepting maybe some of us who are legal experts, none of us read those disclaimers, those fine prints which comes with every such thing. So, for example, I didn't know personally until some time back, about a few years back, that the moment you upload a picture on Facebook, I have actually given a right to Facebook to use it in many ways. I didn't know about it, but that's a fact. So that's just an example. Now, does it mean I'm opening up my own privacy by choice, consciously, through a subconscious state of mind? But it has become a real part of our life. So it's very important that we remain a little conscious about it. Now, does this all that, sometimes it sounds scary. For example, there are a lot of incidents which happen. We read about it in media day in, day out. People sometimes get scared. Do I still use? And actually there is a big movement globally where people are actually withdrawing from it. But that's a very temporary phase. I personally believe it's a very temporary phase. It's not going to be a feature to say so. It's up and down. So with those tremendous benefits, what is it that you got to live with? There is something you got to be making use of, but we have to be very careful of how do we mitigate all these risks which come with this. Now, that's an individual side of view. That's a independent individual side of view that what does this whole thing mean for us. Similarly, from an enterprise perspective, from a public agencies, from government perspectives, there are so many things which are which are creating this whole constant, linkage of identity management in multiple ways. So I'll talk of an example as we go forward in this. We very consciously picked this word called the identity problem. And why we picked up this identity problem is because we in our course of life, in our course of multiple activities, not that we change our identities, but by way of we changing our roles, our presences, our responsibilities at a given point in time, it links up so tightly, but we don't realize that it's really getting linked up in the background. For example, who is who and who knows who and who does what is a question which always prevails in the background, in the unconscious, subconscious state of affair on this whole creature, as we call as a social network or the web or whatever you might want to use a word for that. But the links and the degrees of separation, the 30 degree of separation is much talked about subject. It's being used very, very effectively by multiple analytical tools to trace down all the linkage which are established. Now, things like, we talked about connecting these various pieces of information. Things like, if you really look at this example, that Mr. Joseph Karbala is one name, and there are multiple addresses given on certain aspects. So there is a driving license number, there is a phone number, there is an address, and there is a name. And of course, there is a photograph. In multiple uses on social networking, multiple uses on the web, on the various service providers, on various places that where the usage of this person has happened across the globe. The linkages can be so tightly linked up in terms of the close match, the exact match, the multicultural match, that eventually you can link down that is this the same guy? Is this the same guy which has got different identities but linked up through some context, through some lever or other. When that happens, there is, and why I won't go into technical part of it, but giving another example of, while that was a very clear relation of one individual into different roles, how the contextual relationship gets established on this. For example, if someone has a car registered at an address, which is the same address, where someone else, the same address which someone else has given as an emergency contact. And that, is again linked with someone who is a suspect in the armed robbery for a common phone number. And then it goes through a common phone number on, through a certain guy who is on a watch list. Now, these linkages for all of us as individual might appear to be very irrelevant, something that we perhaps don't think about. None of us really think.
And what you do depends on the perspective of who's looking at it, actually. So one good thing I actually realized here was, forgot your password, and the 10 things about yourself are very linked. So have to be careful about that in future. So thanks, Raman. So we'll go to the next one, Mr. Neeraj Gill.
Come up from there. So a little bit different from cybercrime in general, or a little bit different from something which affects us as individuals, but more of what a CIO should be thinking of when we are looking at video communications, video conferencing, or what government organizations should be looking at. So what are the challenges before us? And these challenges before us as either CIOs, as IT experts in our own companies, or as leaders within the government, there are different challenges coming up before us because of a rapidly changing environment. We want to be able to talk to each other, and if they can't see each other, they still want to talk to each other, but they want to talk to each other from wherever they are. So you want to have a meeting, but you don't necessarily want to get into a conference room. There are, at this point in time, it's a statistic which may surprise many people. There are only 2.5 million video conferencing enabled boardrooms in the world. That's it. There are no more. It's just 2.5 million. So imagine that at this point in time, people still need to walk into these 2.5 million video rooms in order to be able to do a video conference with each other. But that's changing. This is how people are meeting. So you can sit at your desk, you can actually have a phone which is video enabled, or you can have a personal video conferencing device, and you can talk to people who are sitting in these 2.5 million conference rooms. You can talk to people who may be on mobile phones, so people who are not perhaps on video. But that's how you are collaborating. So therefore security becomes a little bit more difficult. It's gone out of the conference rooms, it's gone to people's desktops, it's gone to phones, so on and so forth. So video at the desktop, just to give you another statistic, I just talked about the fact that there are 2.5 million video-enabled boardrooms worldwide. So what's changing? The number of people who are expected to be using corporate supplied, remember I'm still talking about enterprise, the number of people who are expected to be using corporate supplied, high definition video conferencing sitting at their desktops by 2015 is vastly different from the 2.5 million boardrooms. That's about 200 million. We expect that by, this is according to Gartner, we expect that by 2015 that there will be 200 million users using enterprise supplied video conferencing software or hardware sitting at their desktops talking to each other. So the amount of issues that the CIO has to grapple with, or the IT security experts have to grapple with, suddenly increases 100-fold. You've gone from 2.5 million rooms to about 200 million people sitting at their desktops doing video communication. So certainly the challenges increase. Beyond that, collaboration is still changing. That's not the end of it. We do not want to be sitting at our desktops anymore. We don't want to be sitting in the boardrooms. We also don't want to be sitting at the desktops. So where do we want to be? We want to be anywhere. I want to collaborate when I'm sitting at my house. I want to collaborate when I'm sitting in a hotel. I want to collaborate when I'm sitting in a coffee shop somewhere. And a lot of you may have seen that movie, Zindagi Na Milegi Dobara. If you remember, Hrithik Roshan is doing a video call from the bonnet of his car. So you want to collaborate from wherever you are. I mean, it's something that is something which is very much a part of our psyche today. That we want to be able to do whatever we want to do from wherever we are. We want to collaborate from anywhere, anytime, anyhow that we please to collaborate. That's exactly what we want to do. And a term which a lot of people may be familiar with is BYOD, which is bring your own device. So people, even within corporates, are going to be able to now say that, Mr. IT manager or Miss IT manager, I do not want to use your corporate supplied device. I will use my own device. You need to allow me access into visual collaboration, into the intranet, into the email system, into whatever else is there, whatever systems are there, but I will use my own device. So CIOs are beginning to grapple with that. And in the picture that you see here, somebody sitting at a bar or a coffee bar somewhere doing collaboration across a laptop using a camera sitting on top of the laptop. And the percentage of workers that will be mobile by 2013, and all these dates may change here or there, right? But the fact is that that is the direction that we are going in, is about 35%, according to IDC. 35% of all knowledge workers, and Microsoft would probably bear that out, or they may push for higher numbers, is the fact that 35% or one-third of the workforce is mobile. So you want to collaborate from anywhere, anytime, across any network. This is what it implies, any network. You're sitting on a service provider's network somewhere, may or may not be secure. You're sitting at home somewhere, you're sitting in a hotel somewhere. Collaboration is changing. So the devices are moving. We talked about boardrooms, we talked about corporate supplied, nice, secure video conferencing devices. You went to people's desktops, you're using your own laptops, which have inherent problems, which may or may not be infected by viruses. And you've gone all the way from there to certain mobile devices, right? You may want to collaborate across mobile devices. Children will be collaborating across mobile devices. What you see below is essentially a collaboration happening between children. They are working on an application which allows them to share homework, right there. So collaboration is changing. People are going to be collaborating in whichever way that they can. The number of video chat calls that will be made by 2015 on various devices, it's an astonishing figure, is 11 billion. Now this, of course, includes any non-enterprise video calls as well. But 11 billion is an astonishing figure. The number in this past year was 550 million, or 550 to 600 million. What does that mean? That means that it improves or increases about 24. That's it. So these are all challenges which sit before CIOs, which sit before us as OEMs or vendors. When we go sell to a CIO, we've not only got to be able to sell the solutions to collaborate, we've also got to be able to talk about the challenges that these engender and how to meet those challenges. And so what are the 5 drivers of visual communications? April 2010 is when the iPad got launched. It took about 3 months, 80 days, for them to be able to sell about 3 million units. Last year, there were about 64 million tablets sold. By 2015, it's expected that different type of tablets, there'll be about 300 million of them getting sold. And so which means that by 2015, there'll be a population somewhere, give or take, about, this is the number which people are throwing around, or about 1 billion such tablets floating around. All of these potentially are devices on which you will collaborate. Networks. you continue to evolve, 2G, 2.5G, 3G, 4G, we don't know which way we are going. But the fact is that all of these make it possible for us to have ever-increasing bandwidth in our control on our personal devices, easy for us to collaborate, send data, share personal information, and do visual communication. All of these. Today, across the world, there are about 5 billion people on 3G networks, 5 billion people on 3G networks, or devices which are 3G enabled. This is rapidly going to go to 4G. Cloud delivery, you've heard about cloud delivery from a lot of people. And about $241 billion US dollars worth of services are going to be transacted across this thing by about 2020, according to Forrester, and so on and so forth. If you look at the last number over there, about 66% of all mobile traffic is going to be video. So video is here to stay. It's part of our lives, one way or the other. And this is, something which I heard, which I believe is absolutely true, is that video is the new voice. So voice is passé. Right? Voice was there. Voice is now something which you're so used to, you don't think twice about it. Video is still something that you think about. It is something which is in the initial stages of adoption. But it is something which is rapidly going to become the new voice. This is our own journey. Right? We started in 1992 with those conference phones. We got into video conferencing in 1998. We got into immersive telepresence, which are studio-based video conferencing kind of devices, which is in 2007. Today, what is the biggest thing before us is not all of that, is visual collaboration across mobile devices. That's the biggest thing before us. This is an example. Whether it's an iPad, whether it's a Galaxy Tab, whatever it may be, this is how you visually collaborate. The software will sit across any of these devices, allowing you very secure, or as secure as you want to make it, communication, visual communication, with fairly intuitive user experience. And the more easy it is, the more you're tending to adopt it. And the more you tend to adopt these things, the more of a nightmare you create for the CIO in order to how to secure all of these things. And these devices allow you things such as multi-point capability. So you're having conferences. It's not that you're talking to people 1:1. You're actually having conferences with 4 people, 5 people, 6 people, 6 locations, and you're sharing content. So all of this is getting possible now from pretty much anywhere. So nobody can dictate now which network I'm coming from, how secure my network is. It is something that I choose, that I'm going to be any place at any point in time, and I'm going to collaborate. Now, if we look back before unified communications, security was relatively easier. We'll go back to the example that Justice Bose gave, very relevant, in the fact that in the earlier days, you actually had a gunman standing outside the bank, and you used to be able to guard all your money and valuables inside. Well, before unified communications, you had a telecom system, and you had a data system, relatively secure. So if you're looking at the telephone security, are the communications closet secured? Is your PBX secured? Are the trunk lines, somehow secured? Is there going to be some possibility of eavesdropping over there? But that was about the limit of, what you looked at. As unified communications came, all of these networks merged. So these networks are merging. So beyond all of that, there are all kinds of other issues which CIOs will be looking at. What ports have to be opened for this kind of collaboration to actually take place? So how secure is it? Can someone eavesdrop on calls? How do devices authenticate? Because now the devices have changed. Earlier on, you had PBXs, so you had extensions at each table. You had desktops. You didn't even have laptops at one point in time. So, fairly easy to secure. So what kind of devices are coming in? How do we authenticate those devices? How do users authenticate beyond the devices? The devices themselves are vulnerable. So the devices are vulnerable, and therefore your network becomes vulnerable. So all of these issues, plenty of issues. So what are the fundamentals which people grapple with, right? Which is confidentiality at the end of the day, integrity of data, integrity of devices, and the availability. It's not just confidentiality and integrity, it's also availability. Does the network degrade? What happens at that point in time? Can I still communicate? So all of those issues are there which we need to grapple with. And how much security do you need at the end of the day? We've talked about security and security and security, but at the end of the day, there are levels of security. So how much security do you need? There is generally a trade-off between the level of security that you're going to have and the functionality perhaps and the flexibility that you can have. Different organizations obviously have very, very different needs of security. So you've got to define, as the IT head, as the CIO, as the leader of the organization, how much are you required to do? And if, based on how much are you required to do, there is also how much can you afford to do. It's very different for a government organization and where security is paramount affordability, it becomes another issue over there. But if I'm a CIO of an enterprise, then the cost is very much paramount. And then what are the challenges that we face within these issues? We still have to enable flexibility and multitasking. People today, at least the newer generation, wants flexibility, wants multitasking. We talked about BYOD. We want to be able to join conferences. We want to be able to join meetings anytime, anywhere, from wherever we are. So that flexibility is required from any device that we want to. Multitasking inherently something which is required. We need to provide an excellent user experience. Usability has to be easy. If usability is not easy, people are not going to adopt it. If adoption is not there, my investment goes to a waste. So therefore, that is also required. We need to avoid network instability from oversubscription. So if you also make it so easy and you also make it so attractive, then everybody wants to jump onto it. So if I'm an IT company and I've got 100,000 users, do I allow all 100,000 users to actually have access to visual collaboration? If I do, then what happens to my bandwidth? Right? Does my entire network fall down? So bandwidth management becomes equally necessary. And consistent levels of security become equally important. So we have to grapple with all of these issues. Again, you've got to right-size your security. And forget about the number of security features written over there. That's purely a part of what we provide as part of our solution. But your security can be something which is fairly low, always on. You can have a slightly higher level of security or perhaps medium level of security. But if you do all of that, then there are issues that you deal with, which is that you require the IT administrator's attention. Somebody will have to audit that. You will have security experts. So there's some level of attention required. And as you go up the chain, whether it's higher security, maximum security, and when you reach a point where security becomes more paramount, then flexibility, ease of use, you will compromise on the functionality at some point. So all of these, very simple examples. When you look at laptops of people who work in knowledge areas, people who work in perhaps a PwC, people who work in a KPMG, even USB ports are disabled, right? And a lot of interfaces to their laptops are disabled, internet access is disabled. So functionality goes down, security goes very high. So these are all examples of what a CIO would have to deal with. So this is a little bit of a plug for ourselves, but at the end of the day, if you're looking at deploying a visual collaboration solution, then what are you dealing with? You're dealing with privacy, you're dealing with assurance, integrity, validation, high availability. And for all of that, obviously you require solutions, whether you use ours, whether you use somebody else's. But these are typically the challenges that you will be dealing with and somehow trying to figure a way out of your security needs and the flexibility required based on these aspects. Best practices, video systems or video conferencing is pretty much no different from any other IT asset to secure. So you need to secure them the same way. If there is more detail required on our capabilities of doing security, well, you can download that white paper. But beyond that, if there are any other questions, etc., I'll be very, very happy to answer those. Thank you very much.
Neeraj, that's very interesting. Video-enabled desks today and growing by the day. So thanks a lot, Neeraj. That was very interesting. I'll request Abhishek to do it, and we have limited time, so please.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. The closer we are to lunch, the shorter the presentation has to be, so I'll keep it very short, might be at max 10 minutes. Okay, the topic that I'm going to present today is on social engineering, which is like more or less the accepted core issue behind every cybersecurity attacks. An introduction, I'd like to quote Mr. Kevin Mitnick, who is also known as the father of social engineering attacks. In fact, he was the first non-ethical hacker in this particular community. A company may have purchased the best security technologies that money can buy. They might have trained the best security personnel and deployed them. They might have the best security guards. But even then, the company is totally vulnerable because of the human factor. So the human factor is actually the weakest security link which can be present. So what is social engineering? In terms of simple definition, it uses simple social skills to manipulate people. It's, in other words, an art of deception. So I use my social skills to manipulate you for you to give out information to me, which you otherwise would not disclose. So that's the art of social engineering. The process preys upon two very common characteristics of humans. One, the acceptance of authority. If my superior calls me up and says, hey Abhishek, I need this information, I generally don't try to question him, but I give it out to him. That's what the social engineers know very well. Second thing, the willingness to cooperate with others. It's a general human tendency that, okay, I have to be helpful to other humans. The concept of help desk is based on that. If a customer calls me and he asks me questions, I don't question him back, but I try to respond back to him. That's, again, a second human vulnerability. So what are the broad types? I have tried to list down over here the 7 broad types which are commonly known. The first one, phishing. A simple email comes down to you which has a link. You click on the link, it opens a very well-known website. You enter your user ID and password and poof, gone. Your system has been hacked into. This is the most common attack which happens every day, and even in organizations like ours, we find such phishing attacks going on, might be on a daily basis. Though even we have spam busters enabled on our mail gateways, even then these mails do come through. Vishing, the second type of social engineering attack that can happen, very similar to phishing. All the difference is this is over voice. So you log into an IVR, it asks you for user ID, it asks you for a PIN. You enter the PIN, it says it's a wrong PIN. As a human tendency, I will try to enter all the pins which I'm aware of. Might be all my ATM pins, might be all my banking pins, everything. The system captures that and knows very well, okay, this is what Abhishek is defined of. I can use these pins against him. It's a very direct attack. The third attack called as tailgating. Tailgating is very common in IT companies wherein I don't carry an access card. I follow another associate who has his access card and get into a confidential area or a critical zone. Just because I know the other person is a very friendly person and he'll not ask me, do not follow me. So that's again a vulnerability which I try to utilize. Dumpster diving. This is again a very common type of your cybersecurity attack, wherein all the papers, the CDs, the DVDs which you keep on throwing around might be in your dustbins, other places. Attackers actually delve into that and try to get confidential information. It's very important that we properly shred all our data, might be on papers or might be on CDs and DVDs. We sanitize them completely before we throw them out. The easiest way is just break the CDs and DVDs before you throw it out, which most of us don't do. So it's very critical. Shoulder surfing. This is again a very common attack when you're in a public place. You sit in an airport, you plug into your network over wireless and you just enter your user ID password. You never know someone behind you is actually watching you, entering your user ID and password. Happens in restaurants, even happens in your own work area when you're working on a desktop. Eavesdropping, the act of secretly listening to confidential information in your conversations. Happens around the coffee corner, again happens in most public places. You generally don't tend to look around when you're discussing with your colleagues about critical business deals or critical business information. You feel that, okay, I'm discussing with him and we both are in the same boat, so there's nothing to be lost. But you need to look around you and see what's going on. The final form is pretexting. This is a little technical in nature, the act in which you call in a help desk, they try to get basic information about you saying, okay, sir, I need some information to validate you. What's your date of birth? What's your mother's maiden name? You just give out those information. The same information can be used by that associate to hack into your systems. They can use the same information on the same call center network. So this is what we know as pretexting. Fortunately, pretexting is one of those attacks which is legally defined and captured in many regulations. So that's a good thing to happen. So what constitutes an attack? There are two basic domains which constitutes any social engineering attack. The first, the physical aspects, like the work area, the place where you're standing, where you're discussing, where you're working. The second is the psychological aspect, which is mainly 3 parts. One, it can be persuasion. The person will try to persuade you to give out information. It can be impersonation. The person will impersonate someone senior in your company or someone who's very key person and try to get information out of you. And finally, the most important is friendliness. Friendliness is something which most attackers try to break into. So that is something, the most critical psychological aspects behind most attacks. So can I identify an attacker? Unfortunately, anyone is capable of attacking using a social engineering technique. And also the methodologies are so simple that it's very difficult to detect. But yes, the good news is that there are certain characteristic traits which can be detected. A few which I have listed over here. they generally refuse to give any contact information about themselves. They tend to rush around. They want to do the complete activity in a very quick time span. So they don't want to wait in queues or wait in lines, nothing like that. They have a tendency of name dropping. That, yeah, I know this person by his first name. Yeah, he told me to come and meet you over here. So please give me access. So they generally tend to use the name dropping technique. They get intimidated on questioning. You delve into their activities. You question them about who they are, why they have come, and all those details. They get little intimidated. Committing small mistakes. A very simple example is in a work area, everyone knows where the restroom is, people who work over there. There are some cases wherein there are instances wherein they don't know. Even though they are not a guest, they portray them to be employees, but they don't know where the simple restroom is. So those are the small mistakes which I am tracking about. Requesting forbidden information. So we know that, okay, there's something critical in the data center, but we don't tend to get into details about what's the firewall, what's the technology which we have implemented. These people will try to get into that. So these are some basic characteristic traits which will actually help you in identifying, okay, this is a social engineering attack which is possibly happening. So let me be a little wary. What can be the impact? Impact can be huge. I have taken this particular data from a Norton cybercrime report for 2011, and the dollar value itself speaks for itself. Okay, and the core thing is to understand that most of these cybersecurity attacks have been based on social engineering attacks. Social engineering is the basic platform based on which people try to get information before they launch an attack. So that's why this is very critical. Impact can be loss of any of these three components which are equally important. One, confidential information or data which you hold about yourself, about your organization, which might get lost. Two, corporate reputation and brand, which is very critical in today's world. And finally, most important, the source of revenue, your clients. If you are part of an attack, it's going to impact your clients also, and it's going to impact your business. So what do I do? I am concerned, okay, I know there are threats, what do I do? The solution is simple and very age-old, what I'm going to discuss today. I'm not going to get into any technicalities for this. Something which we call in our organization as PPT, not the PowerPoint presentation, but rather another day-to-day used terminology is called as your process, people, and technology. The three building blocks for any firm. Though this is a known factor, but there are some concerns or some gaps which do exist in the systems. One, our priorities are wrongly set. We generally tend to focus more on the wrong priority order. We focus more on technology, focus more on processes, and don't consider people as a point of focus at all. So that's the first gap which we find. Investments, excuse me, investments have to be made in the right pockets. We make a huge number of investments, a lot of investments in technology, but the other two factors, the process as well as the people, have to be equally invested into also. Awareness needs to be a key tactical and strategic goal. We cannot have awareness in the system based on only security incidents. It has to be a continuous process. So in terms of priority, technology, it's important. I won't debate that. But it is only as good as the people who use it and the process which defines its uses of boundaries. It independently is of not a very good or very high value. Will technology add value? That's no longer a question. It's a known fact. Yes, it's going to add value into the system. But there has to be a balance. The balance has to be between the investment that we do and the requirement which is present. This balance is something which we need to sit and think and then plan our investments accordingly. Process, the next level, is very important. Why is process important? Because process defines what the technology does, what the people does. It is very important that we define the process at a very early stages of any formation of any technology implementation. Why? Because process has a very bad tendency of defining itself. If we don't define a process, what happens? The things that we do in our day-to-day activities becomes processes which might not be actually correct. So it's very critical that we define the processes before we implement technologies, before we bring in people to run those technologies. A critical point, a flawed process can lead to bringing down the entire system. Even though you have the best of technologies, you have the best of people. People, which as per my presentation, I'll consider the most important factor. It's a core building block behind every organization. Why is people important? Because people run technologies, people define processes, and most importantly, people also run other people. So it's the only common factor among all these three pillars okay, which is a building block of any organization. It's highly important on two factors: that people are properly trained in the activities which they are doing, and second, the mapping of the people to the activities have to be very important. I cannot train a physical security guard and post him in front of a firewall and say, okay, you are a security expert, why don't you prevent attacks? No, that's not possible. The mapping has to be very proper. Okay, luckily the last slide. To summarize, social engineering attacks mainly target people, your employees. So it's very important that we focus on them. Every such attack has a physical and psychological aspects, which I already spoke about. So it's very critical that we focus on both the things when we are looking for a solution for social engineering attacks. All social engineering attacks and attackers have visible trends, though it's very difficult to identify them. But yes, there are trends which if we focus on, we can break into something. Impacts of any such attacks can be multidimensional. What I stated is only a dollar impact, but if you look at the other impacts, the clients, the media, the regulatory aspects, financial aspects, the impact is actually huge to manage. Organizational security is only as strong as its weakest employee. So if I have around 1 lakh people in my team, if 99,000 are very strong, one is weak, which means my organization is weak, which is a problem for me. Technology is only as good as the employee who uses it and the processes which defines its usage. So let's focus back on the people part of this entire gamut. People is very important. Let's focus on them. 3 things that we need to focus on people: the awareness part, the trainings part, and the proper role mapping part. I'd like to finish by quoting Vice Chairman, who says the Indian software industry needs to ensure that the high levels of security and data protection become a strategic differentiator. Thank you.
Thanks, Abhishek. Abhishek is, by the way, responsible for getting the security certification for Cognizant. The hackers and violators keep him very busy throughout the day, actually, and I know it very well. So thank you. Thanks a lot, Abhishek. Mr. Kadam will go next. Thank you.
And before Shubho reminds me, I am setting up a counter so that I am reminded before my time is up. All the same, I am very happy that I have got a very committed audience who have skipped the norm. Right, once again, good afternoon, and thanks for having the patience to wait up to the last speaker. I am going to talk about this topic, securing sensitive personal data or information in India. Now, before that, I'd like to introduce my organization, ISACA. ISACA is a global organization, almost 100,000 members, and the motto of this organization is to serve IT governance people. Now, who are these IT governance professionals? IT governance professionals are those who could be in the IT development field, IT audit field, IT security field, and their motto is to make sure that whatever IT implementation is done for the organization, it meets the enterprise needs. So that's a very important aspect. We support the enterprise governance by making sure that appropriate IT governance, information governance is implemented. How we do that? These 100,000 professionals working voluntarily for this global not-for-profit organization, we contribute our ideas, contribute best practices, and help develop lot of standards, lot of best practices. I am going to talk about those a little while later. The topic here is how do you secure sensitive personal data or information in India using COVID-5 for India's IT Act. Essentially, the objective is IT Information Technology Act 2000, about which many speakers have talked about, which talked about protecting using PKI, public key infrastructure. The 2000 Act did not talk so much about privacy or any sensitive personal data or information. This was subsequently amended in 2008 and then further clarified by means of a number of rules. Now, what exactly is sensitive personal data or information and why we need to protect it? Speaker after speaker had talked about the threat of cyber security threats, hackers trying to steal information from you, So what exactly is this information that the hackers are after? And if you think a little bit, every speaker has talked about the same thing. The hackers will be after your password, because password today is really the key to everything that you are holding. All the digital information that you have got, all your financial assets that you have got, everything, your credit card information, anything could be directly accessed if somebody has got your password. Then all the financial informations, bank account, credit card, debit card, even physical, physiological, mental health condition. Why somebody should be interested in that? Obviously, somebody could exploit that, somebody could blackmail, somebody could threaten. That also is one of the very secure, sensitive personal information. Sexual orientation, medical records, history, biometric information. Biometric information today is used for access control. All of us know about Aadhaar, fingerprint, retina scan. Why they are being used? To positively identify a person. If somebody is able to steal that information, all your confidentiality, all your accesses are totally stolen. You don't need to have in social engineering, somebody is able to get everything about you through this sort of exploit. IT Act wanted to make sure that this sensitive personal data information must be secured. Whose responsibility, who is obliged to protect this sensitive personal data or information? IT Act has very clearly defined the body corporate that possesses, deals with or handles any sensitive personal data or information in a computer resource which it owns, controls or operates. Now think of it. There are so many organizations who handle this sensitive personal data or information. The first thing that comes to our mind is the banks, all financial institutions. The definition is so broad, it could be a firm such as a partnership firm, sole proprietorship such as consultancy firm owned by a single person. That means a chartered accountant having customers' data, customers' personal information, financial information with him. He is also covered under this IT Act. Then pathological laboratories, doctors. Now think of it, anybody who has got access to any of these data that we talked about and who is processing that using a computer resource would be covered by this IT Act. Now that becomes quite a stringent sort of requirement. Other associations or individuals, professional bodies, organizations engaged in commercial or professional activities. So even, I'm sure, BCCI, organization like ISACA, all of us have a lot of this personal information, and we are all covered under this IT Act. And if, what happens if there is an SPDI breach? SPDI is short form for sensitive personal data information. If there is a wrongful loss or gain, it will lead to damages, compensation to the person affected. And to make sure that you are securing this sensitive personal data information, you are supposed to have implemented reasonable security practices or procedures, right? If you don't do that, and if there is some breach, there are fairly stringent sort of punishments with specific wordings, intent to cause or knowing that he is likely to cause wrongful loss or wrongful gain. There could be a penalty of 3 years of imprisonment or 5 lakh rupees of fine or both. Now, as Justice Bose said, these probably are not invoked so often. Probably the cases are not reported, or even if they are reported, they probably are not having that high priority. But does it mean that the body corporate should ignore these things, should ignore this obligation, should ignore the responsibility to secure this sensitive personal data or information which is in their custody? It is, if there is no penalty, if there is no legal prosecution, think of it the reputational aspect, the customer confidence aspect. So that's the reason probably all the body corporates will not wait for some case to happen and become publicized and come in the newspaper. As a proactive measure, I am sure that they are going to take all reasonable security practices to make sure that none of those breaches probably would happen. Obviously, a full 100% security is never possible, but we will do as good a job as we can. Now, where does ISACA come into picture? As I said, ISACA is a global organization of information governance professionals, and it started its journey around 40 years back. And as a collaborative measure, we have been busy in developing a lot of best practices. The first one was to publish a COBIT, which was an audit standard Then it's COBIT 2, which was a control standard. COBIT 3 was a management standard. COBIT 4 was an IT governance standard. And COBIT 5, which has been published just in April, is a governance of enterprise IT. Apart from IT governance, there are a lot of other publications that were also published during the 2005 and 2007. So as you can see, our journey to make sure that we propose best practices to be followed by the industry to ensure there is a good implementation, good governance of enterprise is one of the things which is ongoing activity for us. What are the COBIT principles and how exactly these principles could help? COBIT principles are very broad, defining that we have to meet the stakeholders' needs. So in case of sensitive personal data or information, that is one of the essential needs for the stakeholders to make sure that the organization secures this sensitive personal data or information. Anything that is being done should be covering the entire enterprise end-to-end. It should work as a single integrated framework. It should enable a holistic approach, and it should separate governance from management. So how exactly it goes about it? Now, as earlier speakers talked about, the hackers seems to be very, very active, very intense in their efforts, leaving no stone unturned. If somebody is launching a worm like Stuxnet, which takes 2-3 years of very systematic development, they have got all the resources to make sure that they are able to breach anything. Obviously, an enterprise also should take equal amount of efforts. How COBIT has suggested that we should go about it? It starts with identifying the stakeholders' needs, stakeholders' drivers. In this case, the stakeholders' drivers are very obvious. The technology and the legal domain, legal environment has changed. The law requires you to protect the personal information. These are the stakeholders' needs to optimize the risk that we are exposed to. From here, we identify the enterprise goals. From enterprise goals, we identify the IT-related goals, and then we identify what exactly will enable so that we are able to achieve all these goals. We have got a distinction between external and internal stakeholders. ISAGA wants to make it very clear, governance is a separate area and management is a separate area. Governance is something which sets the direction. Management is something which works upon that direction and makes sure everything is appropriately planned, built, implemented, monitored, and so on. So that's the reason they have given very clearly whose roles and whose responsibilities to make sure that these implementations are done in an appropriate manner. How exactly this is done? They have suggested 7 enablers, starting with principles, policies, frameworks, and others. I'll come to these one by one. Beginning with, for sensitive personal data or information, you need to have a very clearly defined privacy policy. This privacy policy has to meet the IT Act requirement and all the reasonable security practices. You need to have clearly defined procedures. You need to have security policies and you need to have security procedures. Where are you going to get the processes? And whatever you do, you have to have very clearly defined processes. COBIT has got 37 processes. By careful mapping, we have been able to identify 10 processes which meet the needs, which the requirements for securing sensitive personal data or information. The next one is you need to have clearly defined roles and responsibility for the organization, the governance responsibilities as well as the management responsibilities. One of the very important aspects, and many speakers talked about that, is culture, ethics, and behavior. Now just think of it, why culture is so important. There was a news item that the Fukushima nuclear reactor disaster. After investigation, what they said, that this nuclear reactor disaster happened because of the blame goes to Japanese culture. Japanese culture of unquestioned obedience to the seniors. If the senior says something has to be done in this way, nobody will argue. What's the cultural issue for Indians for privacy? And speaker after speaker talked about that. We very easily share the information. We trust other people. We share our passwords. We had one example of the bank manager issuing a memo of sharing the password. We share our personal information. Everything we share. We really trust so much, and that's a cultural issue, which also is one of the enablers. We have to make sure that appropriate leadership behavior, appropriate influence, appropriate walk the talk, all of these things should be there so that you are able to appropriately build the culture for security. You might have n number of policies, n number of procedures. If people do not have the culture to follow those, then all these policies and procedures will be shelfware. Nobody will ever follow them. Next one is information. Obviously, information is the key. The data transforms into information, transforms into knowledge, creates value, and drives the business processes. And you have to make sure that this information, various quality goals, various information security quality goals need to be addressed. Then you have got various services, and we are talking about cloud services. If somebody is providing these services to you, even then, the accountability for all that sensitive personal data or information is with the organization. You cannot absolve yourself that it has been all sent on Amazon or on Azure or somebody. You are totally responsible for whatever services that you are taking. So that means you need to ensure security in all these services. Lastly, we talked about people, skills, and competencies even in the last session. Making sure at each level, it's not that the security policy has to be only taught to the general staff. Right from the board level, people have to understand what are the risks, what are the responsibilities, what exactly is the right behavior, right skill, right competencies. Right, this topic is quite vast. ISACA has something like 6,000 members in India with 12 chapters. All these 6,000 members collaborated together and built this paper, Securing Sensitive Personal Data or Information, using COVID-5 for India's IT Act. To my knowledge, probably this is one of the first comprehensive technical white paper, technical publication that has been created, and I will encourage you. I suppose that link is also given in your CD, otherwise this presentation will be available to you. Visit this site, download this paper. One of the excellent things about ISACA is all its publication, COVID for information security, the SSPDF using COVID-5 for India's IT Act, each of these are available free for download. And this is definitely going to help you. A lot of you are youngsters who probably want to pursue security as a career, and ISACA also has got a lot of certificates, CISA, CSAM, Seagate, CRISC. If you look at the job advertisement, you will always find these certificates being given very, very high ranking. So I encourage you to visit this site, join the discussion group. Up to 20th August, this is an exposure draft. You are free to give suggestions, how to improve it, how to make it much better for our own use for securing sensitive personal data or information. Thank you so much. I took exactly 14 minutes and 44 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Karam. We do not have enough time, so we'll take one question from the audience for any of our distinguished panelists.
So my question is to Mr. Raman Kalra. Good afternoon, sir. My name is Abhishek Dey. I'm a first year MBA student at ISWM. So my question is that just some time back I heard a comment, an old comment from the chief of Amazon, Bezos, that he's not going to earn his money from the books he sells, but he'll earn his money from the customer taste he gets when a number of customers in millions maybe buy products from him in a 6-month time duration. So, sir, and ultimately he'll be getting his revenues from that data. So, sir, is it good? Like, is it good that we are buying something in a longer duration and then some site, let's say Amazon, sells this data to someone and they get all the data, how they can manipulate our tastes?
That's a very valid question. I think this needs to be seen in a little larger context, because otherwise this problem will be pretty much for everybody on the smarter commerce today, on all the e-commerce kind of things. Most of these, the whole business model is not really making money out of that transition that they carry out. For that whole piece of business is driven a lot by consumer insight, and that consumer insight in turn leading to advertisement revenues, and on one side of it, and on the other side of it, there is so much of contextual consumer behavior which is being linked up. For example, you go and buy a book from Amazon. By the time you click that, I like this book or I buy this book, that information has crossed over to multitudes of sites and multitudes of data warehouse and information seekers across the globe, that suddenly there will be thousands of people reaching out to you, suggesting to you, recommending to you books of similar taste, similar genre. So there is so much of interconnected revenue that happens on these, that it's a part of business. Now, coming to your question that the information that you therefore have provided to carry out that one transaction, is it fair on their part to share the information?
Yes, sir.
That was your question. Is it fair on their part to share the information to others? This is exactly what I meant when I was talking initially in the beginning that, it's a trade-off. And I think Neeraj also talked about it. So it's eventually a trade-off between how much personal information you are willing to share to receive a service on this whole platform of e-commerce, whichever, whether it's Amazon or in the Indian context, whether it is, any of them. Now, our study still reveals that, and so it's a whole process. They make their money out of somewhere, you get benefit out of it somewhere. So it's a trade-off. There is no finite answer to your question that whether it is fair or unfair on their part to share this information. You have allowed them to use it in 10 different ways.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Before we formally close this session, may I request Mr. Shubho Samanto to please present token of appreciation from the chamber to our speakers, to Mr. Raman Kalra, to Mr. Abhishek Ghosh, Mr. Neeraj Gill, and to Mr. Avinash Kadam. May I request Mr. Probit Dash, the Managing Director of Webel, to please present a token of appreciation from the chamber to Mr. Shubho Samanto. There's an important announcement to make. Post-lunch, we are going to assemble here sharp at 3:30. And there's a very interesting session post-lunch, so I'll request you to spare half an hour or 45 minutes more post-lunch and stay with us. Please don't run away. We have a live demonstration on ethical hacking, best practices of how to protect your most important data will be demonstrated. So I expect all of you to be with us post-lunch sharp at 3:30 at this hall. The lunch is at Palladian Lounge, which is at the 3rd level. You will find the elevator and the staircase.
May I request Mr. Aniruddha Singh Rautela, Mr. Jayant Pariyal and Mr. Pritish Mukherjee to come. Well, as I understand that some of the audiences are still having lunch, and whether lunch or not, it reminds me reading an article about climbing Everest. So the question was, which part of the climbing is the toughest? It was found the last part of the climbing is the toughest because, say, about 20 people start from the base camp, and the last day you find hardly around 4 odd people out of 20 are left. So the hall was full in the beginning, but now I think we have thinned out, and I must congratulate all of you, those who are present, by saying that when the going gets tough, the tough gets going. So you all are toughies that you are enduring to the last. Now to my right, Mr. Aniruddha Singh Rautela. He has already had a session and he is going to speak to you on enterprise security and give you the tips on how to secure the computing infrastructure. We have had a dozen of speakers before him, and they have spoken to you about what are the threats on security. Now, in this particular session, we are going to have certain hands-on tips. Over to Aniruddha Singh Rautela.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I completely agree with you. Only the brave come back after lunch, and only the bravest are ready to present after lunch, because I have to keep you awake now. And for the first time in my life, by the way, I had a baked rasagulla. I've never had a baked rasagulla, and it was awesome, really good. Unfortunately, there's no time here. I was thinking I'll go to KC Das, pick up some sweets. But my driver just called and said, I think you'll have to walk 2 kilometers before you can get a vehicle which is moving outside. So with that context in mind, I'm going to quickly take you, again, 10 minutes. I don't want to overcomplicate because I can see some really, really young faces. You may not have worked with technology so much, but I just want to land 5 points that you must consider, which are building blocks to how you build any computing infrastructure, whether you're setting up office or whether you're setting up a new application in your within your office, or you're looking at upgrading an existing infrastructure and trying to do it in a secure manner. Okay, so quiz time. Good morning, good afternoon. Everybody awake? So who knows about the US Embassy cable leak? Who's the guy who did the leak? Correct. Full points to you. No gift, but yeah, full points. So, guys, just imagine US was so embarrassed by some 250,000 documents of the types like the Saudi king actually asking US to go bomb Iran. Imagine what would have happened between the two countries in the Middle East, which prima facie otherwise are like bye-bye and friends. But here they're actually asking things like these to be done. Diplomats asking, diplomatic people asking, go spy on that guy. Let me find out what's he doing, what is he up to. These kind of things are very embarrassing situations which have happened. Another thing, you heard about the Navy war room leak. I know we have some people from the services, they would have heard of. This happened here in India, in Delhi. All you needed was one good-looking US diplomat lady and a USB disk. That's all you needed. DRDO. Anybody heard of this? Okay, this was a classic case. Oh, we'll do security. We'll change the OS. We'll write our own OS. We'll do, we'll change the world upside down. And what the hackers? I'm like, who's the hacker here? It's the Chinese. It's the nations outside India who are actually looking at getting the complete information. They don't care about what OS you're working on. They don't care about what application. I'm telling you, you bring me the most secure OS that you think you have made. A Chinese guy will probably reverse engineer it within a couple of hours or days. He'll tell you things that you don't know about your own OS that you have created. So you just don't underestimate what is possible. If anybody has read about Stuxnet, has anybody read about Stuxnet? Stuxnet was a virus which required a nuclear scientist level of capability to build, so that I could actually bring down the nuclear fusion process in a nuclear plant. Can anybody around here do this? Do you think you can do this in the next? You think you can do this? Huh? Okay. Anyway, all the best. It took a couple of countries and a couple of organizations put together and thousands of research to actually do these kind of things. So never underestimate what the adversary is actually capable of. So what these guys are interested in, hey, you have some 10 algorithms which DRDO is looking and validating, which India will use. Or let's do one thing. How do we get those algorithms? Let's hack the supply chain. You understand supply chain? So DRDO is maintaining their own systems through a vendor. It could be HCL, Infosys, Wipro, TCS, somebody. I hacked the supply chain. The guy who came to service the systems walked away with 12 hard disks. Whatever's there in it, I don't care about the OS. You can dump the OS. It's the data that I'm after, and I'll be able to decrypt it. I have tons of cloud computing paths so that I can get it out at any point. And guess what? They planted some other hard disks in that place so that a typical officer would come and boot up. I can't log in. What's the problem? After a couple of hours, the guy will say, you know what, sir, I'll reformat the system for you. You'll be up and running. So when he started reformatting 6 systems, 7 systems, then they saw a trend. What the hell? Somebody's changed these hard disks. These are not our hard disks. Somebody's walked away with the critical data. So the most secure firewall, the most secure OS, the most secure coding really stands no this thing. And similarly, you have many, you can read these. These are, things are picked up from the Indian newspapers, online newspapers. In San Francisco, there was a data leak and things like this. So my presentation is kind of aimed at telling you 5 things that you can do. Because if you see a common line that runs through these 4 hacks that I talked about is, these were absolutely preventable. If you encrypted the data, even if somebody had taken it, nothing would have been done. If you had blocked the way a person walks in with some material and walks out with some material is checked, you could have validated at that point that, hey, you never walked in with these hard disks and you're walking out with these hard disks. Vendor equipment check or whatever. Usually, I went to Writers Building yesterday. I was there giving a presentation, and so the guy actually took an interview of me rather than, after he scanned my, anybody been to Writers Building? You scan your bag, right? Sir, इसमें लैपटॉप है या नहीं? हाँ है. अच्छा, और ये क्या है? तारे हैं, सब पावर केबल हैं. और हार्ड डिस्क है? हाँ है. और ठीक है, और क्या करेंगे आप? अच्छा, प्रेजेंटेशन देना. अच्छा, ठीक है. ओके, आप जाइए. That's the security check. And when I was walking in the right way, there are cables all over the place. Today there's technology that I can just walk those 3 levels and come down, and I can actually pick up the frequencies from those cables. The data which is moving in those frequencies, I can actually pick up those and interpret that data. I can have a small disk which will be like the size of a phone, which could be 1 terabyte of data in it, and I can capture all that data on it and walk out. So it could be the budget presentation data which is working out here, and just 2 days before that I got all that information. So I can pick up stocks, or I can, do tons of different things. So what I'm trying to say is that, we traditionally have been setting up infrastructure from the point of view that let's get it functioning and then we'll think about security. Or let's get hit first and then we'll think about security. And then in that context also, we're only thinking about what's the problem? Is it an antivirus? Is it a firewall problem? Is that it? Is that all that we need to look at? And anything beyond that, it costs too much money. Let's do one thing. Let's format the system, and next time if we get it, we'll do something about it. So most organizations keep doing that. And when I'm saying most organizations, I'm talking about India. And most of you who are probably in the IT space, you will find yourself that, hey, I have to get this application up and running by August 13th. I can't even think about security. I can't even think about how this infrastructure is going to be standing and where it's going to be standing, on what configuration is going to be. So our environment and culture is such that it doesn't support our initiative. Now, there are 5 things that you can do. Number 1, when you pick up a computing platform, though I'm from Microsoft, but you try and look at it from an independent point of view, that what are you going to do with that? You're not going to cook something on it. You're going to use it to connect with other systems. You're going to use it to store some information on it. So you need to take a call what platform you should be on. Next is the identity piece. So we'll talk about the identity. Then we'll talk about the new network, the newer way of looking at the network, not the traditional stuff, the stuff you already know. Firewalls, everybody knows. But what other levels of firewalls do you need to look at? Then what are the different information protection controls? And lastly, a well-managed system is always a more secure system. Given a choice, if somebody shows you 3 buses, one is completely broken down, another is kind of not looking that nice, but one is a brand new Volvo bus, and all 3 of them are going to the same destination. I'm like, which bus will you pick? Naturally, that nice Volvo bus, it's nice and clean. It will definitely get me from A to B. That ramshackle bus, I don't even know whether I'll manage the first turn or whatever thing. So basically, a well-managed system will also be a more secure system. So when you're talking about the platform, and when you're looking at the OS, whether you're looking at the client OS or you're looking at the server OS, there are certain parameters we talk about the data layer, the network layer, which are your key layers, because that system is connecting with something, and that system is storing some information. That information could be stored in such a way that 3 people are using it, or it could be such that only individual person is going to use resources on that single system. So how do you take a call? You have to see a platform which can give you the capabilities to meet these different business requirements. So that's the number of things. So there are a number of data protection technologies in Windows. There are a number of network connect technologies in Windows, which is there. So once you've selected your platform, the next most critical infrastructure that needs to be built, which is now an afterthought in India. If you look at UID is an afterthought. It's oh my God, we are so late, but something we need to do. Something that we thought we'll get with PAN card, we couldn't. But with the UID, we are looking at having a clear identity on every Indian citizen, what he is allowed to, what services he's permitted or what he's given to, and how we can actually optimize the way government works in terms of disbursing funds to people who are unprivileged. At the same time, even from a criminal tracking point of view, I can know that this person, this is the job he's doing, these are the banks he has, these are the kind of transactions he's doing, this is where he's getting money, this is where the money is going out. All that transaction you can do so you can understand whether a terrorist funding kind of an activity is happening or not. So identity plays a very critical role. And so every organization, today most government organizations, if you actually go to, they don't have a directory-based system. They don't, I mean, there is no way that you're connecting and saying that, these are my users, these are my assets. Assets are computers, printers, or any other network resource that you have. Nothing is defined. So everybody is almost a self-IT administrator in most government organizations. Ad hoc work is happening, goes down. Sometimes people come and build it up using their own system because they've been asking some staff to actually come and repair a system. He doesn't come for 2 weeks. This guy goes down to, in Delhi, there's a place called Nehru Place. You can pick up a Windows CD for $50, install it, you're up and running. Your work is getting done, who cares, what's the threat to the government there. So these kind of things typically happen. So identity infrastructure is super, super critical that needs to be put in place. On this infrastructure, you build what are the policies, what are the different types of access, remote access, application access, data access, network access. And then of course, taking to the larger discussion around how identity management needs to be done. When did this guy come into the organization? When did he change his department, therefore change access to different applications, and he leaves this organization? What are the different things which are involved in managing him through that life cycle? Those are certain key things that you need to look at. So user creation, user deletion, user migration, all these are very, very clear things that you need to have. So identity plays a super, super critical role in laying down the foundation for any compute access. Now I can guarantee 100% that one of the first few things that people do, and you must have done when you first came across a computer with an internet, was create an email ID, right? Yeah, that's your identity on the internet. How do I write to you? It's an identity. That's how I'm going to give you access. Then you use that same email ID to authenticate yourself into a number of, let's say, if it's anirudh@gmail.com, that becomes my identity across the Google network. Anything that I go, that's the only piece that I need to know there. Similarly, on a Microsoft network there. So that is the same concept that you need to apply in your infrastructure. And once you have this identity infrastructure put in place, so once you have your computing platform, your identity, the next most important thing is to marry some policy. So you have a person who's the, let's say, he's the chief finance officer. He'll have more privileges. He can access a certain set of applications. And I am, let's say, a software engineer. I'll have a very different set of privileges, very different set of applications to use. So these capabilities have to be defined, or these roles have to be defined. And only role-related access needs to be done. In the Indian Armed Forces, you have these very specifically defined. Every rank has a particular role and a privilege and something that can be done by that particular role. So they're very clearly defined. That's why you have such a well-structured and a well-functioning organization. So similarly, policies need to be put in place. These policies are simple things like, here's a guy in finance. He just needs the 3 applications to work on. That's it. Nothing else should run on his system. He doesn't need USB. He doesn't need CD. He doesn't need, things. And he's working on budget details. Therefore, policy is he has to have his hard disk volume encrypted completely. So that's a policy. So that's how you marry it to roles, or you can marry it to people who are doing certain things there. Now, doing this is kind of difficult. Security Compliance Manager is a kind of a tool which is available, which can tell you, what are the policies for a particular application, and you can select the policies and apply. So I'm skipping over fast because this will be totally alien for most of you. You're still in school. So the next most important thing is the network. The network, as we know today, is, most of you would have heard of VLANs. After firewall, the next security thing that most people talk about is I have a firewall and VLAN and I have everybody, kind of separated. But really, I was seeing one lady here. She was sitting with a with a tablet kind of a thing in her hand, which was her phone, as well as a computing device connecting to the network from right here. When I switched on my laptop here, I could see her wireless network, which was enabled. And if that had a vulnerability, I could have gotten to her system there. We have another presentation on hacking that's going to happen here. We'll tell you how these things can happen. So basically, what's happening today is your perimeter. You understand perimeter, your boundaries, is getting redefined by the place and position you are. Right now, I'm here in this room here. My perimeter exists here, and my policies need to be conditioned to this perimeter. When I'm in the hotel, it's a different thing. When I'm in my house, it's a different thing. When I'm in my office, it's a very different thing. So my perimeter gets defined by my mobility options that I have. And everywhere, I need to be doing things. So when I'm at home, I use my Xbox and Zoom to present on my TV. So those protocols and those things need to be open. But everything else, which is my office related, specifically IPsec related connections, all of them get disabled. So how do you build all that is using a bidirectional application intelligent firewall, which if I could say 101% of the people don't use. In the sense, it's there, it's on, I don't know. It's like, I haven't seen this species of animal ever. No network administrator makes the effort of using this to configure it to make it a little more stronger, more context specific in your environment. So that becomes a very, very important thing. The other thing is that, you've done the airport security model. No matter how many times you go to the airport, you're checked. If by chance, let's say you left your wallet in the car and you come out, again, you're put through a check to get back into the airport. That's the SOP, the standard operating procedure. Now, every system which is mobile today, like I am here right now, I connected to the NIC network, I connected to the hotel network, I connected to the Bengal Chambers network. Now I'm going back to my office tomorrow on there. How does my administrator know that, hey, I may not have connected or picked up some malware, some threat onto my system? So that's where network access protection technology comes in. And this is an added layer that you need, which needs to compensate your antivirus, which needs to compensate your personal firewall, which needs to compensate your VLAN, because VLAN is functioning at a very different level, and give you that defense in depth today. So that defense in depth is what you will get with a network access protection capability. Another thing that we don't do here, and what we generally have is a straightforward VLAN configuration, which is just working at network level. VLAN is a network appliance configuration that you will be setting up. But what's happening increasingly is that it's the application that you need to be worried about, because hackers don't care about your network anymore. Network is invisible. It's the application where the information is staying. It's the first presentation by the Oracle representative in the morning talked about your database, your application is what is residing the most important information. And to get my database, I don't need to care about what VLAN where and all. If there is a VLAN created and I have a route into that, I can use 20 different applications to connect into that database, which talk the same protocol. There. So what I need to do is that further lock down what protocols can be spoken, what application can talk. So here is an application which is sitting on my laptop, and here is a database which is sitting there. I can say, you applications, you both need to authenticate to each other, validate that you are the genuine applications. So if I get my rogue application which my friend has written for me, and I try to connect so that I can pull some data out, I will not be able to do, because I'll fail. There. So it's even application identity needs to be established. So that's what server domain isolation does. It's basically a concept of creating virtual enclaves. So I can have, for example, DRDO. Somebody's working on BrahMos, somebody's working on Akash, somebody's working on something else. All these teams need to be absolutely separate. Again, the number one threat there is the insider threat. You're working on BrahMos, but you're spying on Akash, project and getting information out. So you need to create these very strong and very granular, right down to the application and data level boundaries within how the computing infrastructure exists there. Then, everybody knows the internet is the big bad world, and everybody knows you use the browser as your number one application to connect to the internet. But on almost every security discussion, every security pen test, every security hardening activity, everybody, I know, and I work extensively with Deloitte, EY, KPMG, and all these others around security, and this thing never comes up that, hey, browser is a very important application. It's an application which helps you get to the internet. It's also the application which is the one which is giving you, which is giving hacker the social engineering access window into your thing. If it's how many of you have come across a browser error which says the site you're trying to visit has an invalid certificate, but click here to continue? And keep your hands up. How many of you have clicked on click here to continue? It's okay. Even I have. So everybody does. I mean, even my mother does. I don't know. It just said click here to continue. I didn't see you. But people just always click on that thing. So what happens is that hackers know this, that moment they do this, so no matter what, network level firewall, inspection firewall or scrubbers and malware things and anything that you put at the network level all becomes blind because they cannot read the data, the payload, which is happening once your exchange happens between, once the exchange happens between your browser and that malicious site. So these are things that you need to do lockdown. So as an organization, you should say lockdown. Anytime this prompt comes, please remove that option saying click here to continue. There. So block it down. So these are simple things like, how you can actually block down rogue things. And there are like 5,000 different things that you can actually do on a browser to do a complete lockdown to bring in securities. Because browsers today, you can have a lot of plugins, and these plugins, as an end user, I have no way I can validate whether it's a genuine one. As an IT administrator, I have no visibility to even know what he's installing and what he's not installed. I'm like, who's that end user? Because all you have to do is go to the site and download. Anybody has these Google plugins, Firefox, all developers have these Firefox plugins, different things, right? So these are things which which the IT organization has no view into, and these are the things, or what we say, the ingress routes which hackers know that they fill up your forums where you write, I need help in coding XYZ, and the hackers will be the guys, hey, you know what, you need help, here's a nice tool that I've created and it's worked very well, and they use those forums to socially engineer. Oh, another code developer has written this, let me download this. Oh wow, 100% functionality is there, but it's also a Trojan to do certain activities which you don't know about on your system. So you have to be very, very careful. Then the other thing is that there's this funder called that I am 14 years old, I am a boy, I'm in school, and I'm not supposed to be driving, I'm not supposed to be smoking, I'm not supposed to be doing certain things because I'm a student, I'm a boy, I'm a teenager. So that there is a thing that we have around people's roles. You're a baby, and therefore you're supposed to do certain things. Similarly, the same analogy, if you just take it up to I am a financial analyst, or I can say I am a tax inputting guy, or I'm a marketing guy in an organization. What am I supposed to do? There are only some 10 things you're supposed to do. Everything else you're not supposed to do. So you define something called an SOE. Standard operating environment. That standard operating environment says that here are the 3 apps that you need to use and nothing else. You don't need iTunes. You don't need Media Player. You don't need, XYZ Media Player. Tons of things that people have on their systems. You go into anybody's laptop, you'll have about 40, 50 different applications. So you need to be very, very clear about what you not need to have on people's systems. So what is the approach to take? Today, we cannot define what are the finite set of bad applications. But what we can very clearly in an organization define, what are the set of good applications? And only those, that's what we call whitelisting. I can whitelist these 10 applications which can be installed on a sales guy's laptop. That's it. Everything else is blocked, whether it's a batch file, whether it's a DLL, whether it's a executable. Everything is blocked. This is again policy. So this is another thing that you must consider and you must have in place. So there's a free technology called the App Locker. If anybody's using a Windows 7, Windows Vista kind of a thing, they have these technologies built in where you can completely, block down what application is running. And then you need to have very context-specific data protection. Now, I have a laptop, I'm a mobile guy, my bag is, I can't even see my bag. My bag is somewhere there, that's it. I think you all can see my bag, it's on that side of the thing. If anybody walks away with that, there's tons of information which is going away for Microsoft. So I need to be sure that anybody who touches my hard disk, who touches my laptop hard disk, maximum loss to Microsoft is just the 40, 50,000 rupees that the material cost. No information loss. So how do I do that? I need to ensure using a technology like BitLocker, which is built into Windows 7 to completely volume encrypt that. Next is that I could be a developer and I'm co-sharing a particular physical machine, and I don't want him to be, the other guy to be looking to my system. And usually what happens is like you're a senior management guy in your office and your secretary is doing work for you, and you don't want critical information like
somebody's preparing the budget, somebody's creating certain internal policy. You don't want the secretary to read that and leak it out into the environment. So you can create folder level or file level encryption using encrypting file system. All these are free technologies which are made available in the thing that could be used. And lastly, I could write a mail to you and I don't want you to forward it or print it or do a print screen, or I don't want you to read it tomorrow. How do I have these kind of dynamic policies on it? So I can have rights management capabilities that go with the data. So even if you copy that email onto a USB and take it to Pakistan, sorry, you won't be able to read it because you have to establish your identity. You have to break that encryption into. Even if you try to break that encryption, first you have to work on a 1024-bit identity protocol that you know. So these are various technology which can be used, which are there, which should be used in your thing. And last thing is that every infrastructure needs to be managed. Most IT setups, my experience has been that a company spends 20 crores to set up an ERP data center, and they for 6 months to 1 year, there's a whole lot of activity. Tons of people come, different teams from Sun and from SAP, from Microsoft, and the vendor. Everybody's doing something, and they configure and they go away. And when I reach that place after like 5 years and I do an audit there, in my previous role, when was the last time you looked at your Fiverr logs? 5 years back. 5 years back was the last time we looked at, that was the time we were trying to do some troubleshooting and setting up the infrastructure. That's about it. Nobody looks at the infrastructure. When was the last time you ensured that the USBs are blocked and you validated and done a compliance? I don't know. We just sent the policy, we have no idea. So you're not managing that piece. So there are many things to it. The configuration, the SOE, the standard operating environment. His laptop got crashed, it had to be rebuilt. Once it was rebuilt, did it again come back to that same compliance image or not? Are you aware? Are you aware how 30 systems were reformatted in your organization? Were these 30 systems back on the same policy format or not? 90% of the time, nobody has these answers. That's why you need to have a strong management infrastructure put in place, which can give you this feedback, this BI, this business intelligence. Because only when you know what is wrong, will you be able to take any constructive action to, put in remediation into that infrastructure. So that's really. Those are the 5, things that I wanted to talk about. The platform, the information, the identity infrastructure, the management infrastructure that you need to talk about. And one more point which I mentioned in my previous presentation, which was about, this applications that you built that need to be absolutely secure. So that's really what I, kind of, let me just, bring it back to the agenda piece. These are the 5 points that I wanted to land. And I know some of you are really young to even, process these, but ones who can, these are certain, like in a waterfall model, these are certain things that you really need to consider individually or as a whole if you're setting up a new infrastructure, if you really want to look at building a more secure computing infrastructure. With that, thank you very much.
Best wishes. I hope you can manage to reach in time. Thank you very much for educating us.
Thank you. Thank you.
The last part of this session is to give demonstration. The CDAC, Mr. Jayant Parial and Mr. Pritish Mukherjee, they will give demonstration on how to hack and how to protect. মানে চোরে চোর ধরতে পারে. Over to them.
Thank you for inviting us to give a demo on security practice. First of all, a disclaimer: I am not supposed to show you a hacking demo, so this is not a hacking demo. By law, I am not authorized to do anything that that is not as a part of law. Okay, we had 2 demos lined up. One was a man-in-the-middle attack, wherein we had a pseudo website prepared, wherein as soon as you give your new username and password, I'll be sitting in the middle and giving you what you have given you as your username and password. And the second was a wireless, getting into a wireless network that is secured. Now, I suppose there is some issue with the local network here. We'll be just showing you the wireless network. Okay, the man in the middle may not happen. As you are aware, to get into a log, if you are lucky, you will get it in 10 seconds. If you are not lucky, even if you try for days together, you may not be able to open a log, especially if you have lost your numeric lock of your suitcase. So if you're lucky, you will get it in very quickly, or else it will take a long time. So getting into all this, giving it in 15 minutes sharp, we have 2 presentations, 2 demos. Let's see how much you can do. That's the first thing, that the disclaimer. This presentation is intended to inform the audience about the dangers associated with the computer network devices, and it is not a demonstration of any hacking. It is not a demonstration of any hacking. We had 2 demos, wireless security and web security. We'll give you a step-by-step process of wireless communication, and then we'll connect this one to the connect this PC to this, and where we have a Android device which has wireless capability to act as a wireless access point that will be enabled and will be cracked using a dictionary attack. There is also one more attack that's called a brute force attack. That's a much more time-consuming attack. And the third is we'll be talking about how to prevent your network from getting hacked, especially wireless network. Now, wireless internet uses radio frequency bands to exchange information between a computer and the internet within a range. So, if you are within range, you can exchange information between your Wi-Fi network and the client. Now, the types of wireless security that we have are a open security. Implies that there is no security as such. So, the Mujahideen could get into the Wi-Fi network of an American citizen and send threatening emails across to the Prime Minister's office. Then we had an older security, it's called the WEP, the Word Equivalent Privacy, which is a very weak security as it has already been compromised. And then we had the WPA, that is Wi-Fi Protected Access. And the last, but presently all of us are using, especially for personal use, we have used this WPA2. As it uses AES as the encryption for encryption. Now, this is what is being used by most of us in our day-to-day life who are using Wi-Fi, especially those who are having Wi-Fi broadband. If you have a Wi-Fi router, you will be using an access protocol that is equivalent to WPA2 for getting the maximum security. I'll not go more into the details. Now, while we are doing this testing of the Wi-Fi or trying to see how secure is the Wi-Fi system, we require data. Okay, so all Wi-Fi, if you have mobiles with you, if you just browse or you just scan, you will see that you'll get access to a lot of Wi-Fi networks that are already available. But to get into it, you require a key. So, to hack into this system or to get into this system, you require to have the data traffic that is flowing from in between these 2 systems. So once that is done, you will be having a handshake. There are tools available. I'm not going to name the tools. Interested students, interested practitioners can go to the proper forums to get hold of the tools. There are tools available which will give you this handshake key. Now, once you have this handshake key, you can use it to get hold of the actual key using decrypting techniques. Okay, there are decrypting techniques. You can use either a brute force or you can use a dictionary attack. So today we have a dictionary of around 10 to 12 MB, and that dictionary will crack open your Wi-Fi network. I've already covered this. For connecting the access point using user-rendered data segments called beacons. So you have to get hold of these beacons and then only you can connect to this. Wi-Fi network. The next portion is preventing your network from getting hacked. You should never broadcast your SSID. SSID is the ID that through which the access point can be discovered. So anybody who is having an access point should never broadcast SSID if he wants actual security. Most of us don't change our default router logins or the password that is given by the router. These are easily available on the net. Anybody who wants to get into this router will hack into a router, will first try to get into it using this default passwords. So it's essential that you change your default router logins, and then you use either WPA or WPA2 in the encryption protocol and give a strong password to the Wi-Fi access point that you're going to use. And always, if there is any update, security updates for a router, try to always put them in. So these are some of the security advised. At least once a month you should change router login. WPA password also has to be changed on a regular basis. And you should avoid the temptation to connect to open wireless network just for free internet. You will come across a lot of Wi-Fi networks connected where they are giving you free internet, but in the process you can also compromise yourself by giving away your own details into that network. So I will not go further into the details of this and ask Pritish to get into the demonstration part. Let's finish it. If there is time, we will do the wired ones. On the third network? It's not running. Leave it. No, leave it. No. Come and do it here. Just give us 5 minutes to configure.
That have been compromised. We have seen certain example of DRDO. We are constantly reading in the newspaper that China is trying to hack or some other country. US also we have seen certain examples. Only thing today, what has been over the day, it has been deliberated what infrastructure, what should be the standing operating environment, and then how you prevent, thereafter how you detect, and after detection how you take it to the logical conclusion by applying the legal provisions. The whole aspect of security, cyber security today, these are the issues that has been covered. Thank you once again. I would now, okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colonel. It has been a great pleasure to have you all after the lunch session, and we regret that due to certain technical problems and technical hitches, we couldn't have the demonstration of the hacking. But last but not the least, to end such a fruitful session, I would request Colonel G. Butterbyal to hand over a token of appreciation, a memento, to Mr. Jayanto Parial. Mr. Parial is from the Center of Development of Advanced Computing, and he is a principal engineer. A token of memento to Mr. Pritish Mukherjee. He is an engineer from the Center of Development of Advanced Computing.
A token of memento to Mr. Colonel G. Butterbyal.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Can we have a big round of applause for the people on the dais, please? Thank you, Colonel, and thanks to the speakers. And I thank you all, the lovely audience, for being with us. Thank you very much.
You.